You to specify the difference between absentee ballot IDs and in-person voter participation. I think this thing's been muddled in that, and I would really appreciate it if you gave some, again, clarification why the Georgia laws are limiting particular voters' access.
So if you think about thank you, Mr. Senator. When you address the issue of voter identification when you are walking to a polling place, you are demonstrating who you are for the purposes of receiving a ballot, but you are not asked to surrender that piece, that proof. You are not asked to give it to a poll worker who will then be able to retain it in perpetuity. You show it to prove who you are, and then you proceed to the voting booth. Georgia for 15 years had a similar situation with regards to voting by mail, but instead of requiring you to put identification in an envelope that will be clearly marked for anyone seeking to steal your identity, it instead said you could use a signature verification process. We took exception to some provisions of the signature identification process after 2018, and in 2019 and 2020, those changes were made to make it more equitable and fair for all participants. That was a change that was necessary, and it worked. In fact, it worked so effectively, we saw more people successfully participating voting by mail. But to now change it to an identification process where you have to surrender your identification. You have to surrender it in an envelope that is clearly marked for anyone seeking to steal your identity, that they can open that envelope and get signifying information about you, either a photocopy of your information or distinctive numbers that will allow them to steal your identity, is absolutely troublesome and should create deep fear in any person considering this. It is not an apples to apples comparison. There is no other form where we say that these pieces of information will sit in a box or sit in an office there is no provision for how long and who can have access to it. It is a very real difference with an absolute distinction that can cause harm to voters. In addition, signature mismatch allowed for those thousands of voters who admittedly do not have the requisite identification to submit. It gave them an alternative process to use, and it has worked for 15 years. There is nothing that occurred in 2020 and 2021 to discredit that process, except that it finally worked for most voters. And in particular, voters of color, for the first time in Georgia's history, successfully used it to actually help change the outcome of an election. My challenge is not with whether it's a Democratic victory or Republican victory. It is that it is a harm to voters and disproportionately will harm voters of color who are the most likely to lack the identification. But we should also be deeply concerned about disabled voters and older voters who are now going to have to sacrifice their personal private information in order to participate in elections. And that should be deeply concerning to every American.
Thank you, Ms. Abrams. Really quickly to Sherilyn Ifill, just in terms of the landscape of our nation on voter ID laws and with regard to challenges to voters, how does the Georgia bill fit into that? And can you give us, in my final 1 minute and 20 seconds, just a vision of what the landscape looks like and why this is so concerning in terms of the changes we're seeing and the effect they're going to have on the right for franchise?
Thank you, Senator Booker. I think people do confuse this idea of ID as though we're talking about all one thing. So first of all, Georgia is now one of only 4 states that requires this photo ID for absentee voting. Yes, many states require voter ID, but not all states require government-issued photo ID. So there are 12 states that require ID, but it's a non-photo ID. It can be a utility bill. It can be other forms of identification that connect you to your address. There are some states that require no ID to vote unless you are voting for the first time, and those include Maryland and Massachusetts, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, Vermont, West Virginia, and of course then there are the vote by mail states, Oregon and Washington. So it's really important to understand that when people talk about whether you're for or against ID, there's ID and there's ID. The question is, are you requiring people to have the kind of onerous ID that you have to get by going to the Motor Vehicle Bureau? Even if the ID is free, you have to pay sometimes to get your birth certificate because you may not have it. You have to travel to a Motor Vehicle Bureau in the 21 contiguous counties in the Black Belt in Georgia. The motor vehicle offices are only open 2 days a week. Some only open 1 day a week. So that's really the concern about the ID. It's the kind of ID that is required, and we should not presume that all states that require voter ID require government-issued photo ID. They require some form of ID to connect you with your address.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will not encroach upon the time and yield to the great, kind, gregarious, wise senator from Louisiana.
I think I'm going to call on Senator Kennedy instead. Senator Kennedy?